farms agent here in Johnson County, and I'm joined by Chelsea Reinberg. She is our nutrition, health, and food safety agent. And today we are going to be talking about precious pears specifically because pears are right now just getting into season. So what a better time to be talking about growing them as well as serving them and preserving them. Give me one moment here and I will share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so today we are discussing pears. As far as resources that you can use when growing pears in your own garden, the Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide is something that is a collaboration between almost all of your Midwestern extension-based universities. Um, so K-State is part of this, but it's not our guide officially. This one is distributed through Ohio. You can also find it through Purdue and a few other places. But this is a good starting point for any kind of fruit that you're trying to grow in your yard. Also, if you just search for extension publications on pears, K-State doesn't quite have a ton of fruit publications yet, but you can still find many online. Typically, the states that are closer to you are going to be the more useful ones. So there's some from Minnesota. There's another from Missouri that is very useful. Also, I found a great fact sheet on hood pears, which is a variety of pear from Florida. So there's good resources out there. You just got to kind of dig for them, and we can help you with that at the extension office as well. So at a glance, as I mentioned, right now is when pears are being harvested. It is always early autumn. Typically, it is going to be from August through October, and it's always going to kind of depend on the type of pear that you're growing. So there's two different main types that we're going to talk about. But also, you should keep in mind that just variety-wise, you're going to have your early season pears, your mid-season pears, and your late season pears. So if you're aiming for a very specific week of the year that you're wanting your harvest, that's something to keep in mind as you're choosing varieties. Pears are very easy to grow in relation to apples, who are a close cousin of them. They are both in the Rosaceae family, but apples tend to have a lot more disease and pest issues than pears have. So the maintenance of them is very similar as well. They're both stone fruit, right? So you're going to be kind of caring for them the same outside of addressing those pest and disease issues. That said, fire blight is the most prominent issue that you're going to be encountering with pears. So we're going to talk about fire blight quite a bit, as well as some other insect pests that you may encounter with them. So I mentioned pear types. The two main types that you're going to encounter, really the only two types that you're going to encounter, are your European pear and your Asian pear. And as you can see, just visually based here, they're very different, right? Your European pears are kind of your standard pear that you picture when someone mentions a pear, typically, right? It's always going to have that oblong pear shape, and it's going to be a lighter green color. Asian pears, on the other hand, are much more similar to apples, and they have a golden-ish color to them. Now, delving into kind of the specifics of the differences between your European pear and your Asian pear. Again, oblong shape. These actually do not occur naturally in nature. So they have been cultivated for about 3,000 years now, but that mentioned, they don't occur, out in forests and whatnot. It's something that's purely through cultivation and propagation and orcharding where these are going to be existing. They are known as the major pear of commerce. So again, this is the typical pear that you envision when someone mentions pear, right? And that's because these are the ones that are massively cultivated for your grocery stores. Compared to Asian pears, these are going to have a softer flesh, more of a custardy texture to them. They're also going to be sweeter. And they are going to ripen from the inside out, which is something very unique to them. So there's going to be special harvest considerations, and we'll talk about harvesting in a bit here. But just know that pears can be a bit tricky when it comes to harvesting, especially with your European pears. Now, that said, even though they've been cultivated for 3,000 years, there's actually only 20 to 25 cultivars worldwide of your European pears that are prominently grown for their fruits. Looking at Asian pears, as I mentioned, these are much more similar to apples in size and shape and the way you grow them. They are also commonly referred to as Japanese pears, Oriental pears, or nashi pears. These are widely grown in Asia, but over the last 20 years in the United States, they have been becoming more and more popular. So you particularly are going to see these in grocery stores and farmers markets a lot more often nowadays. Compared to your Asian pears, these have a much more crisp and succulent flesh. Again, compared to an apple, they're going to be a little bit more tart, and they ripen uniformly as apples do, as opposed to from the center outward. And these ones actually only have 10 to 20 cultivars that are cultivated or grown worldwide. So when it comes to cultivars that are specifically recommended for here in Northeast Kansas, I do have a list here of ones that have been recommended by many different outlets, right? So with your Asian pears, you're looking at the Shonjuro, Yonashi, Shinko, and Korean Giant. And then your European pears, you're looking at the Harrow Delight, Blake's Pride, Shenandoah, Warren, Harrow Sweet, and Seckel. The Harrow Delight and the Seckel variety specifically are ones that I have seen pop up on numerous publications of recommended fruit cultivars for this area. So if you're looking for something that's, almost like a not guaranteed success, but something that's been, proved and shown to do well, those would be ones I'd highly consider looking into. So as far as plant considerations go, when you are planting a pear tree as a whole, you want to keep in mind that pear trees, when planted, are a medium-sized tree. So left unpruned and unaddressed, they're going to reach about 30 feet tall, and they have an upright growing habit. Now, that said, if you're planting a pear tree specifically so you can be pulling the fruit, you don't want a 30-foot tall tree. So bringing in those orcharding practices where you're specifically and intentionally pruning to keep that height contained is going to be very important. Looking at the tree kind of physiologically and some things to keep in mind, the flowers on them are about 1 inch wide, and they form on a corymbos, which is a cluster of 5 to 7 flowers. This is important to keep in mind because remember, all your fruit is coming from these flowers. So sustaining these flowers as best as possible is always going to be in your best interest when it comes to having a good crop. Now, as I've mentioned before, and I'll keep mentioning, fire blight is a big issue with pear trees. So these trees typically are not grown in issues that have extremely humid springs. Here in Kansas City, we do have humidity, but it's not severe humidity, so we can get by. Most cultivars of your pears actually do require cross-pollination in order to produce a crop. So what that means is you're going to have at least 2 pear trees of 2 different kinds planted in a stand in order to get your crop. Now, the Bartlett pear, the Orients, Baldwin, Kiefer, and Spalding are all varieties that can produce some fruits without necessarily having to have that cross-pollination present. But the cross-pollination is going to help you with having a more substantial crop in those cases. And something else of note is that honeybees are your primary pollinator of your pear trees. So if you have honeybees in your neighbor's yard or somewhere nearby, that is definitely going to help you out because they are the ones that are doing the majority of the pollinating for this fruit. Now, I did want to touch on invasive pears here because we are discussing pear trees. It's important to note that fruiting produce type pear trees are not in the category of invasive pear trees, right? When we're talking invasive pear trees, we're talking about ornamental pear trees. And the reason these are invasive is because they've actually been over hybridized over the last 70 years. Back in the 50s, when these were first introduced and were the most popular tree in America, there was only one cultivar. So they were not a risk of being invasive because that one cultivar was actually sterile. But over the decades, as new hybridizations have been introduced, you suddenly have trees that can cross-pollinate with this tree. And essentially, that sterile fruit was no longer sterile, and wildlife could eat it, and then it spread like wildfire from the wildlife, and now it's invasive. It's important to note that ornamental and fruiting pears can actually cross-pollinate, but you do not want to rely on this. If you do have an ornamental tree in your yard, it is best or is recommended to be removing that tree to control the invasiveness, and then go in with, a fruiting produce type tree for that cross-pollination purpose. When it comes to planting your fruit trees, it is best to keep in mind that the best time of year to plant a fruit tree is in the early spring, or if it is dormant, you want to be planting it in the late fall. So mid-March or October through November. If you are happening, or if you happen to be planting a actively growing tree, you do not want to be planting it any later than April. That is because, or that all comes down to the nutrient allocation of the plant, right? When you are planting a brand new tree, you're wanting those nutrients to go towards root development, and in April, that is when your buds are going to start forming, leaves are going to start forming. So you're putting all those nutrients towards other things aside from those roots developing. As far as the type of soil that you're wanting to aim for with these trees, you want that well-draining loam that's just typical for most of your fruit plants. And you also want that slightly acidic pH of 6 to 7. So you may have to do some nutrient amendments with your soil to get down to that point, because we tend to lay on the alkaline side of soils around here. Now, most of the time when it comes to planting fruit trees, you're going to be purchasing them in a bare root situation. So I want to talk about how to plant bare root trees specifically. You do not want to allow the roots to dry out if you're going to hold off on planting these for a while. So you want to put them into a moist mulch or soil or compost if you're not planting it right away. Do not put it into a bucket and leave it there for a long time, or a bucket with water specifically to soak, because what this actually does is deprive it of oxygen. And when roots become deprived of oxygen from oversaturation, basically it makes it so they can't absorb water. So it's having the same effect on the plant as drought would, funnily enough. So when it comes to planting the plants, you want to dig a hole that is twice the size of the root spread. And then you also want to dig it deep enough so that the roots themselves aren't being bent. So if you see this little graphic we have on the right side over here, that's exactly what it should look like. You should have essentially a freestanding plant right there in the middle. Then when you go back to backfill, you want to try to get all that dirt back into the hole and gently tamp around it to get to that structural integrity back in, and then water it in thoroughly so that the plants can stand on its own. You may consider staking it as well for that first year. Another important thing to mention is to not bury the taper. So that's right where the first roots appears in the plants. You want that one at ground level. And I have here crossed out is don't bury the graft. With pear trees specifically, they are very rarely ever grafted. Apple trees or etc. are very often grafted. So when you are planting fruit trees in general, don't bury the graft, but that doesn't really apply to our pear trees here. So when it comes to pruning, you want to hold off on an initial pruning of the tree as much as you can for that first year. So you can remove dead wood or diseased branches or broken branches, stuff along those lines, but absolute minimal pruning is the best. And that is because the leaf buds on the plants create root stimulating hormones. So again, that first year, you're trying to establish a root system for the plant. So the less leaf buds you have, because the more you've pruned, the less roots you're going to have. So it's best to kind of leave it alone as much as you can. Remember as well that fruit comes from the flower buds, which develop on the previous year. So specifically with pears, the fruit buds develop in July. You want to try to prune before this, but as you are removing stuff, you are not going to see the fruit that you are removing because it's not physically visible on the plant until the year afterwards. So you got to keep in mind what's there that you can see, what you can't see, and try to selectively prune so that you can keep as much of a crop as possible. And then as far as pruning guidelines go, you just want to follow the normal tree pruning guidelines, right? So prune at the branch bark ridge, try not to do topping cuts, but again, with these pear trees, you may have to go in and do some pretty harsh cuts simply for size control, because we have 30-foot tall trees here that we're trying to keep at 12 to 15 feet tall. That said, if you stay on top of your yearly pruning, it shouldn't be too much of an issue, but if you get behind for a couple years, that's when you may have to go in with those harsher cuts for that size control. So I mentioned we talked about when to harvest, and this is something that's pretty important here with your pears, because specifically with your European pears, they ripen from the inside outward. So if you allow them to ripen fully on the tree, by the time you pick that and cut into it, the inside is going to be black and rotten. So you need to pick your pears at your European pears at a very specific time. And the way you can go about knowing when they are ready to be picked or when they should be picked is to pay attention to the lenticels on the skin of the plant. So that's all those little dots that you see there on that top photo. These are technically breathing pores, allowing for a gas exchange, but When these cork over and turn brown, that is your indication that they are ready to be picked. Also, the fruits themselves are going to go from a darker green shade to a lighter green shade. And then they're going to have that pear aroma as well. So that smell that you typically associate with pears, they're going to be releasing gases at this point. You're going to be able to smell those. With Asian pears, it's a little bit simpler. As I mentioned, they grow as an apple, so or grow like an apple. So they kind of have that ripening process that's uniform just with age, and you're going to be able to notice based on their tartness level and on the density of their flesh. So if you've ever uh, bitten into an apple that is not ripe yet and it's been very fleshy and or not fleshy but very dense and kind of starchy, it's kind of the same instant here. You want those starches to kind of expand, allow it to increase the juiciness there, and you kind of have to just go based off flesh density, tartness, and taste. Um, Another thing that is important of note, however, is that your Asian pears will typically be harvested earlier than your European pears. So the harvest window for Asian pears is about mid-August to mid-September, and that's it. So right now. And then pests and disease. As I mentioned, they don't have nearly as many issues as apple trees do, but there are some. Fire blight being the biggest issue. This is bacterial. It is actually spread by the honeybees that are absolutely required for the pollination to have the fruits. So there's nothing you can do on that front. But one of the things you can do to try to control this is to diligently prune the trees. If you see it showing up on your tree, then you want to prune it at least 6 inches back from where that blight is happening. Also, you'll see blight cankers on the tree, particularly in early spring before the foliage has shown up, and you can go in and prune those out as well. Rust is something that will show up on the tree as well. That's something you see just as much on apple trees, right? And they're closely related. That said, rust is rarely as severe an issue that it needs to be treated on these trees. Now, if it is actually defoliating the tree to a point where it can't properly photosynthesize and feed itself, then you can try to go in with a fungicide to control it. But typically, it's just an eyesore. It's not going to affect the production of the tree. Japanese beetles, they eat almost everything, and pear trees are unfortunately not immune to that. So if you're seeing this sort of skeletonized leaves on your plants, it's likely due to Japanese beetles. You can try to pick them off and throw them into soapy water. That's the main recommendation for them. You can try Japanese beetle traps as well, but you need to know that these should be kept far away from your gardens in general because they tend to attract more pests than they actually catch. The purpose of Japanese beetle traps is not necessarily to trap the current year's pests, but what you're doing is you're reducing future generations of the pests because every one of those beetles lays hundreds of thousands of eggs, right? Or I don't remember the exact number. I apologize, but a lot of a lot of babies, right? So every one that you catch, you're reducing the future generation. So um, that said, you're still drawing a lot of those Japanese beetles into your garden with those traps. So the further away they can be from your garden, the better. Plum curculio, this is something that shows up on all your stone crops, is this little weevil down here. They tend to leave a little bit of a hole in your crops. So the best way to go about treating these is to put your plants on an insecticide regimen. That said, it needs to be post petal fall because again, pollinators very, very important for a crop, and we always want to protect our pollinators. So the flowers need to not be present at all in the plants, and then you can go in with an insecticide. Generally, it's going to be on a 2-week regimen where you're retreating for the growing season. And then it's the same with codling moth. You can see that on the bottom right down here. Codling moths leave their larvae in the plant, and then those larvae bury through the flesh of the crops and leave these nasty little holes in the middle. Again, it's just going to be an insecticide regimen that controls these. And then something fun before I hand this over to Chelsea. If you didn't know, 90% of the world's European pear crop is actually grown in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and California. The crop itself originates in Eastern Europe, but because fire blight is so rampant over there, they've never actually been able to have very successful orchards. So the primary orchards for the world are in the Pacific Northwest. And then, as I mentioned, both European and Asian pears have been cultivated domestically for around 3,000 years. So, with that, do we have any questions pertaining to the growing of pears? Okay, well, you keep your questions in mind. I am going to stop my share and hand it over to Chelsea.
All right. Okay. Oh, there might be a question. Before I get started, we'll do the question that was posted in the chat. Curious if the planting times shared were the same for saplings.
Yeah, so typically with saplings, you're going to want to plant in the early spring, again before April, right? Just so that you can get as much of that root establishment throughout the growing season as possible. If you do have any kind of fruit trying to form on that sapling, figure it's probably best to pick it off because you're just wanting to redirect those nutrients towards the growth of the roots. But March through April.
All right, so moving on to, I'll talk a little bit about the nutrition and cooking aspects to consider. So this may be subjective, but in my opinion, the five perfect ways to eat pears is, just really as a snack, either whole or sliced. Pickled pears, if you've actually never tried pickling pears before, they are an interesting approach to a surplus or bumper crop of pears. Poaching them in like a wine sauce or even just a kind of seasoned or sugar sauce, diced and sliced and in a salad. So pairing your fruits with your vegetables makes for a great combination between that sweet and crunchy and then the more savory vegetables. And then baked in any type of dish. So a pear tart or any type of savory or sweet dish, they go very well in. But really, pears ultimately can be enjoyed breakfast, lunch, dinner, dessert, snack, any time of the day. When we think about fruits, we always think about fruits typically as a snack or maybe as breakfast, but they really are a multi-purpose food that can be incorporated throughout the whole day. And ideally, we would try to eat anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 cups of fruits a day. So, a quick little snapshot of the nutrition in pears. So, one medium pear, which is kind of our reference point when we talk about a serving for a pear, it is very nutrient dense. And what we mean by nutrient dense is that there's a lot of vitamins and minerals and other good for us nutrients in a product that has very few calories and is low in fat. So, nutrient dense means it is loaded with lots of vitamins and minerals. Pears are actually really rich in fiber. There is 6 grams of fiber in one medium pear, and we're going to talk a little bit more about fiber on the next slide. Rich in antioxidants. So, antioxidants we've talked about in our previous Dig Your Dinners, but basically, they're what keeps our body healthy. They scavenge those free radicals and those things that aren't so good for us and kind of take them up and get rid of them, keeping our body and our cells nice and healthy and help fight disease. We have a good source of vitamin C. So, like most fruit, vitamin C is pretty prevalent in our pears as well. And then it is a low glycemic index food, meaning that when we consume a pear, because of the fiber and because of the other nutrients in it, it actually raises our blood sugar slower than other things like our potatoes and our other more starchy vegetables. So, although it is a fruit and we know that fruit has natural sugars in it, it does raise our blood sugar slower because of that amount of fiber that it has in it. So we do want to fill up on fiber with our pears. Fiber is really important and helps support our health in a variety of ways. So it helps with constipation, adding bulk to our stools, making it easier to go to the restroom every day. It helps control our blood sugar. As I mentioned, foods that have higher fiber tend to spike our blood sugars less. So when we're thinking about eating straight candy or sugar, our blood sugar is going to spike quite high. But by adding that fiber in, it helps balance it out and doesn't have those significant spikes. It has protective heart health function. So fiber can help protect against heart disease, helps fight against inflammation in our body, which helps to keep our blood pressure and our cholesterol in check. And then last is it helps with weight management. So I always use the reference, you can probably sit and eat a whole bag of chips and not feel super full, but you certainly couldn't eat 6 or 7 pears and not feel full. So fiber helps keep us feeling full, not only immediately, but also long term. And so it helps us stay full and prevent overeating over the course of a day. On the right hand side here, you'll kind of see that chart about the amount of fiber in certain fruits. So guava, we do not have a lot of guava here in the US. That is definitely a warmer climate fruit, but that has 8.9 grams in a cup. Raspberries are kind of the most common fiber that we or fruit that we have here that we eat consistently that is loaded with fiber. And a lot of people don't realize that raspberries are that rich in fiber. When we think about our fiber in our fruits, we typically think about apples, but apples actually fall quite low down the list. Blackberries, boysenberries, passion fruit, and then you'll see pears there. A medium pear is about, like I said, 5.5 to 6 grams of fiber. And so that has more than an apple and a banana and some of our other traditional fruits that we might be consuming. So here we go. Our pears and textures. So as Anthony talked, there is a lot of different pears out there. And when we think about the different types, this chart was from USA Pears, but it basically kind of shows the different crispness and sweetness. So we have that texture, if it's a crisp or a more soft and juicier type of fruit, and then that sweetness level. And so when we're thinking about how and what we're going to use our fruits for, either if we're eating it plain or if we're cooking with it, we want to obviously choose those that are a little bit more crisper when we think about cooking because they're going to hold up their structure better than if we cooked a very soft pretzel, soft pear, and it'll kind of just turn to mush. And same with that texture and then the sweetness. If you want something that's very sweet, just recognizing which of these are our sweet pears and which of those are our very sweet. We know that all pears are going to be naturally sweet, but you have some that fall on that very sweet side. So here, I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but you can kind of see we just have a variety listed here, and we'll talk a little bit about each of those here in the coming slides. So our pears, we have, as I mentioned, a variety. And so when we think about, we want those that have the different types of sweetness. So for example, we have some that do have a natural hint of a lemon lime flavor. All pears taste slightly different based on their sugars and then just their, the genetic makeup of them as a plant as a whole. So the Asian pears, and I do have a couple, we had a master food volunteer that brought some in from her pear tree that she has in her yard. So the Asian pear, as Anthony mentioned, is more of an apple-like texture and is more of like a juicier floral flavoring. Most of them are round or oval. And so when we think about ease of either preparation or snacks, these make a great size for a snack compared to maybe some of those more larger pears. We have, of course, the common Bartlett pear, very aromatic and rich in flavor and juicy. Really, the Bartlett is kind of an all-purpose pear. It can be used fresh. It can be used for baking, poaching, canning, all of those things. So that is probably our most common one that you'll see in grocery stores, and it really is a very versatile, all-around type of pear. Moving on, we have a few other ones here. You can see which ones are best for baking. So the Boss pear is best for fresh, baked, boiled, or poached. It holds up its structure very well because it has that more crisp taste and texture, and then it has that honey sweetness flavor. We have one, the Christmas pear, which I find very interesting because I always know, Christmas time you'll get pears, but they're actually called the Christmas pear because they're the ones that are given out more of that time of year. and they're buttery, sweet, kind of very juicy. And these are best fresh because of their texture. And so, with these, traditionally with Christmas, people will use them to serve as fresh or serve with soft cheeses as appetizers and things like that. And then the Concord, so this is also a good all-purpose pear. When I was researching for this presentation, I actually learned that this pear specifically is more naturally slow to oxidize. So I'm going to talk about oxidization in the coming slides, but pears, like apples, will start to turn brown when they're exposed to the oxygen into the environment. And so this one has a kind of a natural ability to not oxidize as quickly. So if you are using it fresh or serving and having it out for a period of time, this one might be a good option if we're wanting to prevent it from browning. So getting the perfectly ripe pear, Anthony talked about, when to pick it when it's ripe off the tree. But the reality is, a lot of times, if you don't have a pear tree and you're buying them from the store or the market, and I've been there where I bought a pear and it's really hard as a rock, right? And you want to use it, but you can't use it because it's not quite ready. So for non-Bartlett pears, the best way to judge the ripeness is what we call the check the neck. And this is kind of a trademark slogan when we talk about like pears. And so basically what you would do is you would find that neck of the pear and gently press it by applying some pressure. And if it yields to the pressure, then it's ripe and ready to eat. So you're not going to kind of squeeze the large round portion of the pear to check if that's soft. It's really the neck is where you'll check to see if it yields to your pressure, then it is ripe and ready to be consumed. Bartlett's, as Anthony mentioned, their skin does change the color, so it can kind of indicate as the ripeness. If you do have firm, unripe pears, you'll want to keep them at room temperature so that they can ripen. And then once they are ripened, you will put them in the refrigerator to kind of slow that ripening process. Now, let's say you need pears and you need them for a dish that you have to make, but all the pears are hard at the grocery store or they're not quite ready on your tree yet, but you really want to use them. How do you speed up the ripening process? So you can do it a couple of different ways. You can place them in a bowl with other foods that emit ethylene gas, so like our bananas and our apples. You can also place it in a brown paper bag and seal it up. This traps those gases in, which helps speed up the ripening process. To make it even faster, you can, of course, add some ripening fruit as well to that. Avocado is another great one that you can put in that bag to ripen and speed up the process as well. So ethylene is that gas that I said that is given off that helps ripen produce. And if you really can't do anything, or maybe you accidentally over ripen your pears, you leave them in the bowl too long, or you forget about them in the paper bag, the best way to use overripe pears is to just put them in a smoothie or pop them in the freezer and use them as they're frozen. So some considerations for cooking with pears when we are thinking about what we're going to do with that pear. So think about the pears that keep their shape well when heated or cooked. Those are going to be the best that can withstand that heat. And so we have the Anjou pear, the Boss pear, that some of those that are that staple. Even a Bartlett pear really does hold up its shape very well. Then when we have some you want that will be more of a sauce, or you want some that are more of that soft, you want to consider those that are going to fall apart when they're cooked, so that softer texture. And those are better for making things with our sauces and butters. Again, Bartlett pear, it is a multi-purpose pear, so it can be used depending on what it is. And those are some considerations to think about when you're making a dish, the type of texture that that pear will be once it is heated and cooked. So you can always mix both types of pears. So for example, if you're making a dish and you want kind of that texture of that pear to still be present and a nice bite that they get, but you also want some of that great juice that happens when those pears are cooking and kind of melting in that heat and surrounding sauces, you can always use a combination of two different types of pears to really get you that great taste and that balanced textures. So I mentioned that pears do turn brown. And so how we can prevent that from happening, nobody likes brown fruit. And so a few things we can do. This is a natural process, as I mentioned, that happens once the inside of the pear, apple, avocado, all of those tend to turn brown when they're exposed to oxygen. So a few things you can do is you can toss the fruit in an acidic juice like lemon, orange, or pineapple juice. That acid helps to keep that browning from taking place. There are commercial ascorbic acid solutions or powders available on the market. Basically, it's just a vitamin C, and you can certainly use a vitamin C powder if you have one at home, but they do have these commercial ascorbic acid solutions that are available. A lot of times you would either mix it in water and then soak that fruit in that water, or you can sprinkle the powder directly on the fruit. You want to cut the fruit as close as serving as possible. So if you are going to send a pear with your kids' lunch for school, they might not be eating it for 3 or 4 hours later. And so you can't really cut it close to their serving time. So you might have to use one of these other options. But if you can, wait to cut it as close as possible to when the consumption would actually happen. Another option is you can soak the pear or any of your fruit in a diluted honey water solution. So it's about 2 tablespoons of honey with 1 cup of water. You can mix it with other acid fruits like your oranges, tangerines, and grapefruit. So if you are making a salad, make sure you have some more acid fruits mixed in. And then, of course, covering and refrigerating it also helps to prevent that browning from happening. You can preserve your pears by canning. So all home canned Asian pears must be acidified. So these pears right here that you might be growing, these have a different acid level than our more Bartlett pears or the European pears. So these do need to have an acid added before you can them to help prevent botulism. So it's as simple as just adding a little bit of lemon juice to your jar as you're canning your Asian pears. So they can be canned. You just have to make sure that you're adding that acid. The one downside with preserving pears is that the higher temperature that we use in pressure canning can cause some pink discoloration in canned pears. So boiling water canning is your best option when canning pears, which is why when you do the Asian pears, because they are low acid food, you would typically want to pressure can them. But we know that pressure canning causes that pink discoloration. So you add that acid to make it suitable to be water bath approved. So the process for preserving your pears, you'd wash and peel them. Most of the time when we're canning anything, we do peel that outside layer off because the texture can just be changed, and we want to ensure that no bacteria has a chance of getting into our product. You'll cut them lengthwise in half, remove the core. You can put them in one of those ascorbic acid solutions that I mentioned before to help prevent the darkening from happening. It will happen automatically, right? It's just a process that happens. And so by putting it in the solution, it'll just keep that color longer, nice and bright when it's in your cans. You do want a hot pack. And so when I say hot pack, what that means is that you're going to be putting your pears, your cut up pears, in a hot solution, whether it's water, a light sugar solution. You can even use grape juice, apple juice. All of those would work. You heat it in that solution, and basically what happens is that heating process allows some of those liquids to be absorbed, and then also to prevent the fruit from shrinking significantly when you're canning it. And so that is the only way that you can do your pears, is to make sure that they're in a hot syrup or a hot liquid first. You'll take that liquid out, and then you will add your pears. You'll boil your pears for about 5 minutes, and then you'll fill that liquid and the pears, leaving a 1/2 inch headspace. And then you're going to process those jars based on if you're doing pints or quarts, and then of course adjusting for your altitude. Here in Johnson County, we have altitude ranging from 800 to just over 1,000. And if you're over that 1,000 mark, you do need to adjust your altitude. So you can preserve pears by freezing as well. Freezing them is a great way to preserve a bumper crop, but there are some caveats with preserving pears via freezing. As you know, anytime you freeze fruits or vegetables, the moment they're thawed, that texture does deteriorate just a little bit because those cells are broken in that freezing process. And then once they're thawed, so you can select your full flavored pears that are crisp and firm. So you want to freeze those more crisp and firm ones, washing, peeling, and coring them. And then you are going to freeze your pears in a sugar solution. Research has shown that this is the best way for preserving pears. The quality maintains the best when you're preserving pears this way. So you'll heat the pears in a syrup solution, and then you're going to pack those pears in a container and put some of that syrup solution on top of it. Here, you can also add that ascorbic acid. And then when you're freezing something, you do want to just make sure that you're leaving a large enough headspace to allow expansion of that frozen product. There is a tip that if you place a small piece of crumpled water resistant paper on top, it helps to hold the peaches down so that they don't float up, because obviously we know that fruit floats. And so that just helps to keep those pears in that syrup and keep that best quality. So that's kind of the outline and summary of cooking and preserving pears. So here, like all of our dig your dinners, we have a few recipe ideas. You maybe have tried stuffed pear or stuffed apples before, where you take an apple, cut it in half, kind of dig out the core, and put some oats or some chopped nuts and bake it in the oven or even in the microwave. Well, you can do the exact same thing with your pears. You can take your pears, cut them in half the long ways, and then dig out those seeds and kind of make a little hole or well in the middle of your pear. And then you'll just add some rolled oats, some pecans. You can do raisins or craisins, anything that you would want for your dried fruit. And then, of course, the fall flavors. You have to have that cinnamon and maple syrup to bring that kind of life to our traditional fall pears and apples. So here, this one is baked in the oven, but you can certainly, if you wanted a small batch, you could certainly just do one of these and cook it in your microwave to soften it as well. Here's a fun recipe. It is pear and rosemary infused butter. So if you have a surplus of pears and you want to do something a little bit different, you could go ahead and juice your pears and get some unsweetened pear juice out of those pears. And then you're just going to infuse that pear juice with some rosemary leaves and get that nice flavor. You don't actually put the rosemary in because we don't want those particles floating around. So we use a cheesecloth or a tea strainer, and then you just take those out once you're ready. And then you have some other pears, some salt, vanilla, and some balsamic vinegar. These go great with crackers, on toast, on English muffins. It's a tasty alternative to a traditional jam or just plain butter. Pear and cranberry crostata. So this is one of our recipes that we have every year as a kind of demo and sample for our pie baking class that we host in November. And so this is, you just use any of your store or homemade pie crust. Then you have your pears, some orange zest, dried cranberries, salt, cinnamon, allspice, and the ingredients and directions are there. You can definitely take a photo, or as this always, the recordings are sent around. You can rewatch the recording and get this recipe. It's a fun little recipe. It looks beautiful, and it's really not that difficult to make. And with that, for those that haven't already subscribed, we do have an In Good Health newsletter that we put out once a month that has a recipe of the month, healthy tips and tricks around cooking, nutrition, food safety, and everything else above. And if you ever have questions, we have, obviously, my contact information is there, and our general food help email address is listed as well. Are there any questions from the group?
Well, we want to thank you all for your time, and we also want to remind you that we have another webinar coming up next month. That is the Leafy Greens Digger Dinner. So if you're interested in growing fall salad greens, be sure to check that out. We actually have all of the webinars coming up until October, I believe, listed online right now. So you can sign up for multiple webinars if you're interested. Thank you for your time. Is there anything I'm forgetting to mention, Chelsea? The recording of this will be on YouTube shortly. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.